Now we got the little wheel.
Oh, 0.
Yeah. All right. Well, it is Monday, April 21st, and welcome to Solid Ground live stream number 116, I think. I think we're getting way up there in the one teens. I am Leslie Elliott Boyce. I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Kindsvatter, Deborah Knox, Jennifer Friend, and Professor Darleen Lev. So great of you to join us, Darleen. It's good to see you again, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you. And so, for anybody who is curious to hear more, we're going to reference parts of a conversation that Darleen and I had. I guess it was like a month or two ago now. It's been a little bit, but it's up on this YouTube channel. I also put a link in the description to this live stream right now, so if you want a quick reference. It was a great conversation. It's titled An Ex-Feminist Perspective on Childless Women in Relationships, I believe. And I really enjoyed it. It's been a big hit. A lot of people have watched it, lots of comments, so we can get into some of that today. And before we get going, Deborah, do you want to introduce people to Solid Ground if they're not familiar with us?
Sure. Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice and/or authoritarian measures such as medical mandates in their workplace, university, children's schools, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies and answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join our peer support group for $10 a month, and you can join our forum on locals for $5 a month. To find out more, go to our Solid Ground Substack for the peer support groups or Solid Ground Locals for the forum. Please note that Solid Ground does not provide psychotherapy or legal advice, and nothing we do should be construed as such.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Deborah. Hello in the chat to Olivia Maynard, James from Bahia, Celine, Ray. Nice to see you guys. And there's so many different aspects of the conversation that you and I had, Darleen, and it's actually kind of an extension of conversations that all of us have been having for the past several months at least, maybe longer. But there's as a professor, some of the coddling of students that you've been witnessing. That was one thing that we wanted to kind of zero back in on and talk about. But perhaps the most controversial or interesting or crunchy, I don't know, so many adjectives you could use, aspect to that conversation was just the examination of relationship dynamics and the critique that you offered of the feminist perspective and your own, you gave some examples from your own life in how you feel like perhaps you were misled by feminist ideals and have come to think about things differently as you've gone through your life journey. So I don't know where we want to start with that. Maybe I could introduce or ask Deborah or Aaron or Jennifer to give some of your feedback on what you thought after listening to the conversation. What were the holes that were the questions that were left open for you after hearing that?
I think one of the things that was interesting to me was the kind of seeing how the dynamic between men and women is, we could sort of say who started it or something like that. And I think, Leslie, you made a point about the sort of co-creation of each side having their thing they're doing that's causing each sex or whatever to like the separation to become more and more and more. And so I don't really know if I have an extra comment on that. I think it's just like I tend to look at it that way more than either, it's just patriarchy or it's mostly just the feminists or something like that. It seems like these things, there was the technological innovation of the pill that propelled things quite a bit. And there are a lot of technologies that propelled things from women moving out of the private home space into the public space. And then what happens when that occurs. But I think I tend more to like seeing how I'm sorry, my phone is so weird. I can't even get myself in the picture. How we're co-creating these problems and how do we help cope? Because I don't know, Darleen, if you were thinking more, it's the women's, and maybe we could argue this. Is it the women's job to kind of get us on a better track? Is it both sides? I don't know. That's just like an alive question for me that that's what I might say is a potential point of conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Aaron,
Yeah,
what do you
and I
think?
guess it does seem that men and women have trouble connecting. I mean, of course, I would say that as a marriage counselor, but I do see a lot of people who seem to be missing each other. I also see a lot of very lonely individuals who would very much like to connect with somebody, and they they can't seem to make it happen. And this especially seems to happen with dating sites. And I know that doesn't exactly pertain to the conversation that happened before, but in the theme of sort of like people wanting to find something steady, it seems like a lot of people want that, but can't seem to either make it work or find someone who wants the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Deborah, your observation about like this who started it question, I think that's it's really interesting, and it seems like there's a lot of finger pointing and blame if you read these things online. If you read about relationship dynamics and loneliness in men or women, or the way things have, how we've gotten to where we are when it seems like you said, Aaron, so many people are missing each other. We have this kind of epidemic of divorce and schism and on the one hand, the childless women are ruining the institutions narrative that you'll hear from Jordan Peterson and others, and then on the other hand, the sort of incel red pill kind of movement, whatever, all these words that we could use to sort of pejoratively talk about groups of people who are actually just human beings that are lacking in a foundational connection with someone of the opposite sex, which is, I
That
think, what,
and I think
yeah.
I think that that really hits something on the head here, Leslie, which is that people are missing each other. They're missing each other's humanity, uh, and why they do that,
Mm.
I think, is extremely complicated, and differs based on who's sort of in focus. But if I were to say, if there was a common thread that ran through this issue from my perspective, that's it. That the individual is left out of the process. The composite is replaces the individual.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that I enjoyed about the conversation that I had with you, Darlene, was you offered a really, you offered a vulnerable look into one life and kind of dissected some of the influences that, as you look at the choices that you've made or the way that things have gone in your life, you you can call out some of those things and describe how you were impacted by certain social narratives. So maybe that's a good jumping in spot.
Yeah, well, I can also respond to something that Aaron said about how we're dehumanizing each other. So, for example, there's a sort of a mandate when we're teaching literature that the students have to see themselves in what they read. Um, I, as a little kid, got along better with boys than with girls. And there were two girls my age who were constantly, anytime I joined them to play, throwing mud balls at me. And, I wound up spending a lot of time either with the boy down the block or alone in my room. So I didn't really have much luck with girls. Um, and then that also led to reading a lot of stories for boys. So I had great sympathy for boys and a lot of interest in adventure and boy things. But then the feminist project comes along, and actually, it was a few months ago. I was at a free press event, and I met a woman of millennial age, and she told me, this is a quote: "Feminism ruined my life." And it turned out that she too had read Looking for Mr. Goodbar and taken it too literally. There was also another book called Women's Room, and a few other books that I read when I was a teenager that basically dehumanized men. You know, the Stepford Wives, you know, where the men just want to turn the women into house-making robots. And in looking for Mr. Goodbar, you know, when you're a teenager, you can very easily misunderstand the message or the nuances of something. And, you know, in that story, basically, I don't know, are you familiar with it? It was made into a film with Diane Keaton, 1970s.
I'd
She
love a recap.
basically she the protagonist just wants to have one night stands and basically abuse the men that she's having one night stands with, and in the end, finally, the last one murders her. Um, you know, and
Cautionary tale. Sorry.
I actually remember internalizing this, like, you know, and it's funny because, you know, and I actually explore this in my novel. Like, part of me knows that I don't really agree with this, but I'm doing it anyway. And, you know, that you're supposed to treat men like shit because men have treated women like shit, even though I didn't necessarily see that in the world around me, but I'm absorbing this message and spitting it out. It's, you know, it's our time to take over and put you down. When again, that's not necessarily what I witnessed, but I certainly acted on it. And I think also that, you know, if, and I know just from the world that I'm in that uh, there is a lot of teaching stories about being an immigrant to the United States, and everybody's white and you're the only person who isn't white and you feel so out of place. You know, all of these stories that are basically the same story over and over again. You're in this white dominated culture and you don't feel like you belong and you're marginalized. And so you're only reading about this experience and not reading more universal experiences where you would put yourself in the hero's place and there's some kind of universal moral code there. You know, it's all about, like, I went to this place and I wasn't like everyone else and it made me miserable and nobody understood me, is the prevailing narrative. Then you leave that class having learned that you're oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have, and this is something that's going on that I really am ambivalent about, I don't want to have to do this. Then you're supposed to notice whether a student feels sad. Well,
Wow,
you're
really?
talking about things that are going to make them sad, okay? Then you notice that they look sad, and then you're supposed to approach them and talk to them and find out if they are sad. So you're planting the seed in their mind that they're sad. And then you're supposed to march them down to the health service where they're going to get put on antidepressants.
So I want to respond to something from the chat that I think might be helpful for, and I know this is a bit of a non sequitur from what you were just saying, Darlene, but I think that this might be helpful for us to go into a little bit. Danny7190 says, I feel like we really need to be more specific about what feminism is. There are 4 waves of feminism, and I don't think all of it has been bad. And I would like to, I've said this a whole bunch. I just don't really understand what we're talking about when we say feminism. And the reason I want to go into that specifically is because that was a big part of the response that we got from the video that you and I did, Darlene, the conversation interview that we put up. It was directed at feminism, and there's a lot of hate for feminism right now that's really in vogue. It's very popular to trash feminism and to say that feminism is responsible for trans ideology or all the problems between men and women. And I'm not so sure that I agree with that, but I also have never been somebody who's described myself as a feminist. In my lifetime, feminism always seemed to me sort of a harsh, kind of man-hating thing where the girl power, for instance, I've never really liked any of that. That's always seemed like it was it's a little silly. It's a little unbalanced. It's kind of like a gratuitous competitiveness in intersex competition, and but there also, I have a sense that I am glad that women can own property, that we can vote in elections, that we have intellectual equality that's recognized in society. And so I'm not sure exactly what we're talking about when we talk about feminism. And I wonder what are some of y'all's thoughts? What do you say? What do you mean when you say feminism?
Me?
Sure. Anybody who wants to respond.
I think you described it perfectly. It's a competition with men. And the other day, I found myself commenting on Substack. And I said this in the talk we had. The feminism, if you use it as a lens in literature, it really is that the men are oppressing the women, basically, and that has to come to an end. I don't agree with that. I've never agreed with that. And I actually never really called myself a feminist, even if I acted on those. I acted on it. Um, so it's a competition, and I think there was a patriarchy, but there also was a matriarchy. And what I see happening now is with feminism is that the matriarchy is now taking over institutions that used to be sort of more patriarchal in nature. And by that, I mean more logical minded as opposed to feelings oriented. And they are sort of trying to take over and not leave men any patriarchal space. So it is a power grab. And also, I consider feminism something that denigrates motherhood. That's why, I would call myself reforming feminist. Like I'd like to see feminism turn its attention to glorifying what women have done throughout human history, not denigrating it as not as good as what men have done. It was as good and certainly as important. And if women aren't doing that, we don't have humans to care about feminism at all, which is pretty much what's happening. The birth rates are alarmingly low. And, any kind of interactions I've had with younger women online are, I'm not a breeder. How dare you suggest that I have children, as if this is, not a valuable contribution to the human project. So I think, feminism is something that says that what women have done is not valuable and that what men do is valuable, and women have been oppressed or kept from doing it. And when I'm critical of feminism, I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't have a credit card or own property. I mean, but maybe what we need to do is see women as being, part of a team with men again, and not, casting them asunder and taking over everything.
So there's a couple comments that people are giving. James from Bahia says that he agrees with you, Darlene, likes your take on that. Some other good comments in the chat. 97 Cents says feminism is 1, a belief that men and women have equal worth as humans. 2, a recognition that women are treated as lesser than men in some ways. And 3, support for solutions that end that status quo. And then Olivia Maynard has a comment that I thought was a pretty good one. Going to war with Iraq over 9/11 was emotional. Feminism didn't cause that. And then Cesar Borgia says, excellent explanation, Darlene. So you have a lot of different perspectives, and I find this really very interesting. Deborah, what are your thoughts?
I I notice I'm drawn more to how do we get ourselves out of it than who did it.
And
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like somehow that's where my mind keeps going. I do notice though, just kind of going back to what you're saying, Darlene, and how I think about it. I don't know where we end up, but it was this whole, the public sphere and the private sphere were much more divided and gendered in the past. And so the home sphere was where the matriarchy resided, where that power was held. The public space was where the masculine was. And now we're seeing the oozing out, right? It's like the matriarchal thing is oozing out into the public space. And I don't know should it not be there? It's hard for me to say that when I think of some women that could like lead something and do a really good job. But it just seems like when those things oozed into the different spheres, let's just say things got shaken up a bit. And I think some of the oozing of the matriarchal stuff in the public sphere was then this is a whole other topic. We don't need to go down this thing, but that's when it all got, commoditized. Because once something comes in the public sphere, we make it in the realm of the market and we monetize it. And so the next thing you know, there's surrogacy. Like there's all these things that look bad. So I don't know. I can't quite back to say that women should mostly just only be in the home. I would probably be horrified to say something like that. But I'm just noticing some outcomes of these spheres, these energies going into different spheres. I don't have an answer for it, but I want to go back to the humanizing thing because I feel like COVID exacerbated all this because people were all not even going out and seeing people physically, not even the less we're even in just physical proximity, just around people, just around having basic interactions with them. I mean, we can read the stories and that's really helpful to get other perspectives, but just to literally go out and be around and interact with people. I mean, I think that can really help reduce a lot of this, cross-sex animosity or something. And I don't know how that happens. I know myself, I feel even a little bit stunted, socially. I mean, I do go out, but I recognize being stuck in my apartment for several years and only being on screens. I feel a little more, I'm not quite necessarily at the same ease I had of just hey, let me just chat with you and, or feel comfortable even, bonding with somebody yet or something like that. So I feel like there's a bit of a something kind of happened to the collective body of being able to bond with other people from that. And so that just adds to the mix, I think, of this whole thing being difficult of how do we bring people back together again? I don't know. That's several different directions I threw out there.
Well, Deborah, I just want to respond to real quick because when you were talking, one of the things that I keep thinking about when we talk about how things are versus how they used to be, I wonder what kind of fixed point do we have in our mind when we say how things used to be? Because if we go pre-industrial revolution, you would find women and men both working about the same amount in and out of the home. You'd find people homesteading, living, building things with their hands, bringing things to market, working.
Were the women
fields.
going out that much though? Because I mean, I don't think the women were out in the marketplace quite as. I think I met Mary Harrington, and she's made that distinction too.
You might be able to say that they weren't as much, but collective work, communal work, the way that people work together in groups, you wouldn't find this sort of isolationist. I think that when we're talking about a woman staying in the home, like a woman in her home with children
by herself,
and a husband going out and interfacing with the world, that's a very true. That's a very
modern
Victorian sort of high income ideal that doesn't work for most people, most places. Like we look at right now, the modern condition is that being a mother or taking care of children, let's just say, taking care of children is an economic position to hold. Whether you are accepting money for doing it or whether you are foregoing bringing money into a home, these are hours worked. This is time spent. It can be quantifiable in a family who chooses to have the mom or even the dad, but a person stay home, foregoes income that could be brought in, and it's a sacrifice in terms of money that you could either pay it to a nanny or you could have mom stay home. So that you can make an argument that this occupies an economic position in the modern world where people are expected to be able to bring in money in order to supply the things of life. We're not living on a subsistence level existence where we're homesteading and bringing food to table. We're bringing money to home and then buying the things of life. So I guess I wonder when we say how things used to be. That's a thought that always comes to my mind. I feel like we're on an evolving time scale, but when we talk about feminism and men and women and roles in and out of the home, I feel like there's almost this false perception of a fixed point in the past when things were different. Instead of thinking, and I'm not trying to contradict what you said. It's just
Yeah, I don't
what I'm
even need to
thinking
be
as you
caught
do.
on that. I'm just sort of noticing archetypal sort of thing. So I'm not so stuck on. Frankly, I do wonder. This is a really out there thought. Because I wonder if we got into trouble by actually trying to make economic value to mothering and this and that, as opposed to having it be. You're nodding somehow over there, Darlene. Like something like of spiritual value that if we start to put dollars and cents on it, we're sort of cheapening it. But like that's a whole other weird thought I have sometimes. Darlene, you're nodding.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a student telling me that she had read about the wage gap in the other class. And I said, well, it's actually more complicated than that. The wage gap is kind of a myth because women will take time off to have children. And are you saying that a person's value is only how much money they make? And not say doing something of value like bringing 4 humans into the world and nurturing them and creating a nice home for people. And also, I would say there was a time when things were different. That's also the crux of what we were talking about last time. Is it used to be people got married and had children. That's what people did. Now you have more choice. That was also the feminist tenet, that you should have a choice. But when you have too much choice, you can end up in a liminal space, not knowing what to do. And there are also other people making different choices. That narrows the pool of people you have to choose from who want to get married and have children. That used to be just what people did, and now we have choices. And I think the result is it's just harder to do that. And the way that women used to work in the past, I think it's Janice Fiamengo points this out, that it was the Industrial Revolution that really slotted women in the home, and the men went into the factories. And that was also when we started sleeping 8 hours a night, which is also kind of interesting. Industrialized our sleep patterns and everything. But, men and women used to run businesses out of their homes together. A farm is a mom and pop business. One of my favorite places to go down on the Jersey Shore was wonderfully preserved motels, because those were all mom and pop businesses. I would say that moving into the suburbs is what really started the discontent. Women were literally trapped if they didn't have a car. And then they had a lot less work to do, and then they wanted to go to work and not be financially dependent. And now here we are. We have choices, but more people are left alone.
Something I wonder about the idea of choices, and I guess I'm a pretty traditional in my life and what I wanted out of life. I became a mom really young, and have always, one of my more, a lot of my opinions are pretty nuanced. A lot of them are pretty non-judgmental. I try to be pretty open about things, but one of my stronger, probably offensive to some people, opinions is that if you have a child, you should stay home with your child until they're of a certain age. I mean, you should, that the baby needs the mom, and you should be home raising your baby or have your baby with you at work. You should not, this long workday separation of mother and infant is not good for the child or for the mom. So that's probably one of my stronger opinions that some would take exception to. But one thing that I wonder about with the idea of more women having more options and that being a problem, I wonder if, are we missing the idea that there have always been women who would have been left out of this kind of marriage and family scenario? We will always have some women who are not selected for marriage, or who have a husband who dies, or who fails them in some fundamental way to where he leaves the family. You'll always have women who get left out of this perfect picture of man as provider, woman as mother and wife, you know. And so what then? What with those lives? And this is something that I got an awful lot of. I really enjoyed reading the comments on the video that we're referencing, and there were a lot of really good, supportive, and interesting comments. A lot of men being very glad to hear a perspective that wasn't demonizing of men, which I think is really important, because it's not fair to demonize an entire group of people, obviously. But one thing that I was not really prepared for was the amount of comments that were directly demonizing me, because I talked about the fact that I have been divorced, and I have been a single mother, that I have been in marriages that failed. A very common response was, well, it must be your fault. That must be your fault, because women initiate most divorce, and so it's your fault. If you initiate a divorce, it's your own selfishness, or you did a really bad job picking partners, or you must be a terrible woman, or else men would still be in a relationship with you. But the fact is that there are people whose relationships fail, and they still have lives, and they still need a way to provide for themselves, and to find meaning in life. And you know, even if it did fail because it was your fault, isn't there hope that there would be a redemption arc for that individual, and that they would still find meaningful connection and purpose in their life? So I don't know, the options, maybe if everybody's taking this argument. We had this talk with Jenny the other day too. She has this great story about how she grew up in this really avant-garde family, with her parents were really kind of bohemian and sexually free, and this was this really funky artist's kind of lifestyle. And she talks about how interesting that was, and how also it was kind of destabilizing. It's nuanced, and maybe there's a place for that in the world for people who take a different path. But the problem starts when you start folding that in and making that the mainstream, and start celebrating that and trying to normalize that.
Yeah, it seems like somewhere, I think, because back in the days when people were maybe just like, we're going to arrange your marriage, here you are, you're stuck with this person. We kind of don't want that. It is nice to have some agency. And I also see either the paralysis that happens from this consumer model of, there's so many things to pick from, and or people just getting so, myself probably included, like so picky, like, well, if they don't have this, and this, then forget it, you know. And so I don't know where to find the happy medium place of having some choice and say about who you end up with, but not ending up where people just are so, I have to have it my way, you know. And I must say I'm guilty of this. That's why I'm alone, probably. I don't know. I don't know where we find that sort of sweet spot in there somewhere, because I wouldn't want people just necessarily, although some people say arranged marriages work out better because people just deal with what they get, but I don't know.
Well, it depends, right? It depends on how you define a successful marriage. And I think a lot of times people define a successful marriage by if the marriage does not end in divorce. But there are people that have been married for 40 years that are making each other miserable and slowly cannibalizing each other. And I would not really define that, for my purposes at least, and where I gather meaning in my life, I would not find that to be a successful marriage. And I personally, I really love all the options, and it does make things confusing and less stable. But I think for me, it works out with my particular personality profile. The idea of getting married young to one person, and um, only ever having that one lover for the duration of my life holds approximately zero appeal to me. I do have more of a taste for adventure than that, and I'd rather have a few failed relationships, honestly. Um, but I think where it is difficult is, if you are a young person who wants to get married and have kids young, but especially if you're not religious and you're not part of a religious community, I think now it's really hard to do that. And I do think that that's a loss. Because I think that that is something that's normal to want and natural to want. And I think that it's sad if, and it seems to mainly affect women, if women are like, well, I can't find a guy who's willing to settle down with me until I'm 35. And now it's a, what do they call it? Geriatric pregnancy already at that age. So I do see some real legitimate problems for women largely stemming from this. And as I've spoken about before, there were times in my life where I was leaning more towards wanting to have kids and never found myself in a situation that support or a relationship that supported me in that the way that I would want to be supported in that in order to take that um, that type of risk. So I think, like everything else, like all change, there are good things and bad things that have come out of it for all of us. But I don't regret, the invention of the pill or, feminism itself. Although now I believe women do have equal rights. We have particular vulnerabilities that I think we need to be cognizant of, but I don't really feel like we have this big need for feminism in the United States. I think the wage gap is explainable largely, not in all cases, but in most cases, by choices that women make. I don't think that there's this, patriarchy hell bent on oppressing women. Most of my greatest supporters and encouragers throughout my life have been men. Men have, and it's not that I haven't run into some bad guys, because I have. I think I'm like the whack-a-mole of the dating world. Like, you can bonk me on the head, I am going to pop the fuck back up. um, but mostly guys have been really supportive of me and wonderful and encouraging. And and I've had good experiences and bad experiences with men, but I've also had good and bad experiences with women. So it's not like we're all these sweet little innocent things and we all just support each other so much. And if the bad men would stop bothering us and we ran the world, everything would be fine and hunky dory and there'd be no wars. Bullshit. I think any woman who looks within herself knows, like, that is not true. We're, vengeful and, nasty in just a slightly different way than guys are. So no, we would still have wars. Anyhow, that's my rant.
Well,
Aaron,
one thing that that this video went into the Manosphere, and there were some response videos made, and I understand the
didn't know
lingo.
that. That's interesting.
Yes, that's why you have
Wow.
so many views, because some of them went from there to see the whole discussion. And I did say Manosphere in the video, in the discussion, and it must have hit the algorithm. But one thing that they, and I'm very sympathetic to the Manosphere, actually. And one reason why they would have made those comments to you is because there's something called hypergamy. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah, you haven't heard of that. So let's just say, and this is not anything to take personally, because I've done the same thing myself. Okay, it's if you're the question is, when the marriage isn't working, why is the answer to do better outside of the marriage instead of inside the marriage? Why is the answer to say, you know what, this is defective, I'm going to move on and I'm going to find something better outside? If one has made that commitment, okay, and I'm saying I've done that a few times myself. This is broken, I'm going to throw it away and go find something somewhere else instead of fixing it. And it was about 15 years ago, we were talking about in one of my classes about the throwaway society, and how we get these disposable bottles, we just throw them away. When I was a little kid, you had to return the bottles, and your grandpa would fix the radio. He would, things were repaired. Now we engage with all kinds of things that get thrown away. And one of my students said, I think that this is why I threw away a perfectly nice boyfriend, because I'm being conditioned to throw things away. So I suppose we could say, well, I think that I also got into a business relationship with somebody that drove me absolutely insane, and I had to get out of there, and I had to pay all of this legal fees to wrest my project out of this person's clutches. So I absolutely understand that there are some things, you absolutely have to say aren't working, and go elsewhere. But in the Manosphere, the men are very upset about this hypergamy thing where, it's broken. She's out of there. She's going to look for something better outside the marriage and not bother trying to fix that marriage.
So
And
how about this
the
though,
comments
Darlene?
are Schadenfreude, towards me too.
But
Like, oh,
Darlene,
gee.
if I can just say, I think that this is one of the problems with the kind of responses that we're seeing here is it goes back to what Aaron and Deborah, you were talking about the loss of respect for the individual, the loss of the taking into account of the individual. That if in like as in that conversation, you offered some anecdotes, I offered some anecdotes, and I was really attacked for some of the things that I said, even though I didn't give those details. I didn't say, well, I was in a relationship where I went back to counseling over and over again and back to trying to repair over and over again, despite being physically assaulted over and over again by a man who was also cheating on me for years and years. And ultimately, at the end of that relationship, when I had left, I still went back and said, if you would go back to counseling, I would give it another try because family is more important. And so that's not hypergamy. That's not, I'm going to trash this and give up. But the assumption was that because I'm a woman and I have a divorce, that must be why. And so that is where we're losing the humanity. And that is what looks like, I mean, for the first time, and I can agree with what you were saying, Jen. My life, my experiences with men have been really mostly very positive. I've always been around the kind of woman who says man-hating comments. I've known those kinds of women for a long time. And that thread of we're just gonna, kind of shit on men and put them down. And I've always found that really distasteful and ugly. I have wonderful relationships with the men in my family. I have a wonderful father. My brothers are really good people. My friends growing up, I had a lot of male friends. I have 2 sons. I love my husband. I've had my experiences with men have been largely extremely positive, and I'm not a knee-jerk, man-hating kind of person. But what I saw in those comments was knee-jerk woman-hating. Knee-jerk woman-hating. Like, if you're a woman and you're divorced, it's your fault because either you gave up too quick, women initiate most divorces, so women suck, or, this is the one that really gets me, it's still your fault because you didn't do a good job picking. So you must have ignored some red flags. And therefore, if it's the man's fault, it's still your fault because you're a woman. And those kind of responses, I was really surprised to see that. I honestly, and it made me think there's something really sick and really ugly going on that I wasn't fully aware of until watching those responses roll in.
Yeah, well, I got some of them too, I got some of them too. But I think where I'm coming from with this is, and as I said before, and I'll say it again, there are some relationships that are just not working, and there's no other recourse but to get out. But a lot of what I've read in the Manosphere, and I've watched the International Men's Conference speeches, is a lot of women just turning on their husbands and taking everything, and they end up having to pay child support, and it's just turning into marriage is turning into a really bad deal for men. There's an anecdote. Some acquaintance, his wife just turned and said that he was sexually abusing their son, which he wasn't. Basically just vanquished all of his money. And now she has custody and lives in a very distant state. And, he only sees his son once a year.
And with an anecdote like that, though, that's just one person's story, and we could
Can I?
tell
No,
stories.
this is a
But we
common
but
story.
we could tell
It's
stories
not
Can I?
uncommon.
we could tell stories all day long that would represent something on the other side that would look really unfair. So, are we
Can I just say
talking?
something?
Yeah, Deborah, please.
This was something about, because I do think there's something in the zeitgeist. There have been, I have not read any of these. I've partially read the reviews, but there has been a wave of these memoirs, and I don't know if they're novels or memoirs, and they are these married women who suddenly think they need their sexual fulfillment and are sort of glorifying them either leaving the marriage to go do this discovery. So I'm not saying there's more women doing that, but there's something going on that people are publishing books about this. So I think it's, whether it's happening a lot or not, there is the perception, I think, out there in the culture that women are the ones that are kind of leaving these situations and want their personal fulfillment and might even leave their kids for that. So I'm not saying it's actually happening at any large numbers, but there is I don't know if I want to say glorification of it. There's enough that publishing companies are publishing these books, and then these are getting discussed. So I don't know if that's adding to this perception that like women are just doing this right and left, when in fact maybe they aren't, but they're getting high profile and people are bothering to put these people on NPR interview, whatever, right? And so I wonder if that's factoring in.
Yeah, you're referring
saying
to
it's
All Fours by
contributing to the
Miranda
perception.
July.
That's
You're-
one. I
you're-
mean, there's multiple, I
Yeah,
think.
and I've been on her Substack and I read the comments that she in some piece that she wrote, and it was just full of women saying they were going to leave their husbands and do what she did in her book. I was absolutely horrified.
So, I will just say, I think that I kind of agree with something that Deborah said early on. If we start pointing fingers back and forth, we could sit all day long, and I could tell you stories about women who've been wronged, and you could tell me stories about men who've been wronged, and we could go back and forth. I've got stories in my own life of men who've been treated horribly in divorce and women who've been treated horribly in divorce. And at the end of the day, it's the children who are really suffering, and all the people who have glorified something other than family and connection in what they're seeking in life. But pointing fingers and saying this is men's fault isn't really helpful, and pointing fingers and saying this is women's fault isn't really helpful. But how can we as people, as men and women, work towards a solution that centers a positive vision of relationship? Like you were saying, Jennifer, like what is a positive vision for what we can actually be striving for in relationship, and how do we return to some kind of an ideal in a culture that has forsaken morals for laws, where everything is okay as long as it's legal? We don't have to have any kind of spiritual ideals, and we don't have to have any kind of, certainly no sexual ideals, because everything is on the table there. And I don't know. One thing we haven't heard very much from Aaron, and I know earlier you were you look like you had some thoughts percolating and you wanted to say something, so I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I mean, I guess I just would reflect on my own experience, and that may or may not be relevant. But I was listening to what you were saying just now about sexual, wanting to experiment with sex and so forth. Just in my own life, I always found that downstream from companionship, and I wonder what is happening to the concept of companionship in marriages. I wanted to get married since I was 12, and I feel like my life mission was to find my wife, which I did when I was 19, and that's all I wanted. And I have no regrets about that. And so I wonder what people's experiences are when they, I don't know, they feel like they need to leave a relationship. I mean, I do. Like, I understand that the libido is a strong impulse and it wants to do what it wants to do. But I do sort of wonder about where companionship falls into these questions. The other thing I would say is that there's a very complicated balancing act uh, between recognizing the need for advocacy for groups of people and falling into tribalism. For example, one person that I've admired quite a bit is Riley Gaines, who's been outspoken about protecting women's sports. I would view Riley Gaines as a feminist. I guess what would be called a second wave feminist, but she's, I think, a very sort of conservative person and very obviously committed to her husband, but outspoken in her protection of women's rights. That seems to me to be an okay form of feminism. And uh, certainly, I don't know her well, but in watching her, she certainly seems to be a person who's deeply committed to her family and doesn't seem like the sort of person I could ever see uh, leaving that relationship in order to expand some horizon. So I don't know. So those are the two thoughts. There's the balance between sometimes groups do need advocacy on behalf of that group because of particular concerns that they might have, and also in thinking about the role that relationships play in people's lives. I've been reflecting on companionship and to what degree that might be present for people or not in relationships that quote fail. One final thing I'll say about my hackles rise, Leslie, when people are uh, saying nasty things about you, and that because you were divorced you must be your fault, or you must be the wrong kind of woman or something. And I think that kind of begs the question as to what is the right kind of woman. What ideal are you referring to, where someone should be a particular way when faced with an intractable an abusive situation. So that raises hackles a little bit, and it seems to me that people are perhaps letting some uh, uh, unresolved issues influence the way that they're communicating with you, and I prefer that they don't do that. It's a sign of weakness.
What's ironic about that is that when we were having that discussion, I said it twice during the conversation, encouraging people to be gentle, because I knew that Darlene was coming out with these really personal stories and I wanted people to take that with that in that vein. Like, this is someone who's doing something really courageous by sharing the way that their own life has gone in relationship to larger cultural narratives. And I thought that I was pretty circumspect with how much I shared, but apparently not, because it was me that got a lot of
Oh,
heavy criticism.
I got raked over the
Yeah,
coals in the
I'm sorry to
Manosphere.
hear
I was
that.
stupid. They put up a banner that said, "Look who's stupid now."
Oh, geez, Darlene, I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
wow.
Good
So
God.
I,
There was one where it was just so bad I couldn't even listen to the response because it was just, I had no morals. I deserved what I got. I was a pick me now.
oh God.
I'm going to say that, it part of this is the tribalism of women versus men. And I do see that having, I mean, I don't know if that existed 200 years ago, but it really did start to ramp up in the 19th century, this women versus men narrative, and I want to see it stop. And I would say
Yeah.
that one way to make it stop is for, let's say, in a literature class, for women to read books through men's perspectives. Why are we being encouraged to read literature that's only, sympathetic to women and not to men? I mean, there's a whole don't assign anything by white men anymore. This was actually said in a meeting.
Yeah.
Um, we're not going to breed that teamwork that I see marriage as a teamwork and a business proposition. I think that my own errors were that I thought it was supposed to be romantic. I actually think if you lived in an extended family, and I know someone who went through some problems in her marriage and said, you know what, I'm going to stay because of the family. We're not the only two people in this situation. There are all these other people involved. And what has happened over the last decades is that you're more alone with this person.
Yes.
And actually, in the marriage that I got out of, the big fatal error, which nobody who listened to that discussion knows, there are all these variables. He and I, if I look back on what we did, it just breaks my heart. We were living in Chicago and we had all these neighbors around us and our family around us. And I decided that we had to live in a better city. So there's hypergamy can be, extended to just this whole American mindset of doing better. And San Francisco was a better city than Chicago. And so we packed up a van and all these people saw us off. And I'm looking in the rearview mirror at all this social capital that we left behind. And we went to this city where we didn't know anybody or maybe one or two people. And it was so hard. And the two of us were, pitted against each other. And I felt terrified. He was the only person I had that put all this pressure on him. He started drinking again, got in with a bad crowd. And I couldn't really wrest him from that situation, or I gave up. But I think if we had stayed in Chicago around all those people, we would have stayed married. He had a support system that he very much needed because he'd had an alcohol problem. If I were to go into the whole story, he was damaged by his parents' divorce. His father abandoned him in a bar in Denmark to go chasing after some woman in Sweden. It's a crazy story. So, people used to live in more in groups where, you didn't need that one person so much. You had all these other people around you, and it wasn't like everything depended on this one person.
Right.
It's pressure to put on anybody.
Yes.
Either
It is.
way.
Yes. I agree. We're expecting way too much out of our marriages. And that's not to criticize anybody that's been divorced. I'm a divorced person myself. But I think we do have really unrealistic expectations, and we don't have the extended family and the community support around us that takes pressure off that relationship and also supports us in that relationship. And I think that's a real loss, because I think it really does help those relationships to flourish.
Well, and I want to say, James from Bahia, I want to acknowledge this comment from a little bit ago. He says, subjective stories, these are not Leslie. Darleen is quoting heavily held opinions in the Manosphere. And I appreciate that. I really do. I think it's good to be able to talk about these kinds of themes that are coming up. And there's a part of me also that what I see happening, broadly speaking, is a lot of division and a lot of difficulty in connection. And I think that manifests differently for people with different vulnerabilities. So you're going to see it look different for women than for men. You're going to see the thing it's easy to ridicule, all the childless cat ladies, or the childless women ruining the institutions, or the whatever you want to say there. And then it's easy to also dismiss the men in the red pill or whatever it is. You're talking about different camps of people. But one of the things with internet discourse is that it's kind of like a giant Yelp comment section where you're only going to get the very best reviews and the very worst reviews, and you're going to miss the whole swath of life that's just kind of like, the meal was okay, I'm not going to write about it. But the people who are not having those extreme versions of the experience in this thing. And so I think it is really easy to get demoralized by seeing the extremes, because you got the ideal, like somebody called it, like romance is an icon, or it's an idol, or whatever. So you see that big romance. It's this thing that's unattainably perfect. And then on the other hand, you see the real devastation in people's lives when they lack connection and they lack that sort of nurturing relationship, that core foundational connection. So I do think that we end up overrepresenting the tails, but I think that there's so much possible. I mean, there's so many threads, right, to pull on here. We could talk about how I think that the sexual revolution is a huge part of this whole thing. I think this is enormous. And as the great Paul Rossi said, men won the sexual revolution and they lost.
Yeah.
So, it's this kind of, and you could say the same thing of women. You could say women won the sexual revolution and they lost. And I think that that's what we're looking at. If you get all the things that you want, what are you left with? And I'm reminded of, the dog-eared fox study? This experiment to breed foxes that would be more companionable. Well, as you breed out the wild, they look more and more like dogs. You're left with dogs. So if you want it to be in its original form, you have to take its physiology with its temperament. And if we want to breed a new race of people or new kind of people that are like just sexual libertines, we also get a really fucked up life where we're missing connection. You age out of that. And then what are you left with? You're middle-aged and you got nothing. You're disconnected. And, anyway, we could go on, and there's my rant.
Well, I also think that children lost the sexual revolution.
Yeah, well, that's us.
And
that's all of us. We are the children of
we're
that.
saying, Leslie, about staying home with your kids in the first few years of life. I mean, there's all this talk of anxiety. Children are anxious. I would say that probably has something to do with it, being farmed out to daycare. While mom's at work is not breeding very, well-grounded kids. And then there is a lot of divorce and broken homes, and that's also not helpful. And it's also a deterrent for younger people to have children. They just don't see doing that if their parents couldn't do it. So, if your parents aren't modeling that something can be stable. I was having this conversation with my mother the other day, and she has dementia. She's like, I hated your father. I hated him. I was so miserable. I said, well, you know what? You did a great job of hiding it. And really, my hat's off to you. It felt like home. There was a lot of laughter in our home. And I didn't think they were a love match at all, but they did a good job of making it feel like a home.
I will, I know I'm mindful of the time and we're at the hour. So I just want to read this one comment real quick from Olivia Maynard. And Olivia, I'm sorry I called you a troll the other day. I don't think you're a troll. I think you're great. Olivia says, divorce can be for the best. My parents absolutely should have divorced. My mom absolutely should have left. The hate between them made all of us so unwell. I think that kind of goes to what Jennifer, you were talking about. It's not so much the stats. Did you stay married? It's about the quality of the connection. And if we're stuck between an ideal and a failure, there's a lot of middle ground in there. So, maybe we should be shooting for something that's just pleasantly mid. Let's just shoot for contentment and stop trying to perfect everything. But there's so much more to be said. And Deborah, I know you wanted to say something. I'll go to you. And then Darleen,
great.
I'd love to invite you on for a continuation of this dialogue, if you're up for that. So we can keep going and then talk about some more of the things that you and Aaron could talk about on campus and campus relationships. So there's so much more to be said. But Deborah, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah. So my quick thing was, we were talking about comments often being like people think they have to say the one end extreme or the other. So I just want to invite comments from people who maybe don't tend to comment because they don't think they have something extreme to say, who might just report on, how your relationship is or something like that. Because we're not sensing the middle because the middle isn't talking. So if anybody that's in the middle wants to comment on this video, I invite you to.
That's right. Definitely, definitely. Please give us your comments and your feedback. And I thank everybody so much for joining us in the chat. It's been great to have this conversation with you all. Thank you, Jen and Aaron and Deborah and Darlene. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming back for this discussion. I hope we can do it again really soon.
Me too. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you all.